Professor Lewis Falk here at the School of Public Affairs. I teach nonprofit management courses in the department along with Professor Abuasi, who's teaching grant management this semester with many of you. Many of the students in the room have taken or are taking managing nonprofits, which I teach every semester. And then some of you have also taken nonprofit resource development or are currently taking or have taken nonprofit policy advocacy and law, which compose our core nonprofit related courses here in the Masters of Public Administration and Public Policy. So we have a dynamic panel tonight focused on grant seeking and grant management. So really the purpose of the panel is to expose you to both sides of the grant making equation, right? So what are the perspectives that you should know as emerging nonprofit leaders and managers in grant seeking? From the foundation perspective, so how to properly research grants, structure your proposals, make sure that your proposals are going to be seen and going to be funded. And then from the nonprofit side, well, what happens next? So how do you get the grant, but then what do you do once you have the grant, right? So what's the management aspect of grant management, and how do nonprofit foundation grants and government grants and funding impact your other management or other aspects of management within your nonprofit, right? So that's what we've asked the panelists to discuss tonight from their particular perspectives, and then really what the agenda tonight is. I'll introduce the panel very briefly with the perspectives that that we've invited them to speak about, and then ask the panelists to introduce themselves and give a little bit more background in terms of their experience in the sector on grant seeking and grant management. And then if you could, panelists, give one piece of advice that kind of comes to mind first to kind of start the discussion off from your perspective. So either the grant seeking advice or grants management advice, whatever kind of piece of knowledge that you want a kernel of knowledge to start the discussion. And then we're really going to open up the discussion to questions and answers. First of all, I'd like to begin by thanking Professor Jocelyn Johnston, who's the director of the MPA and MPP program here in the department, for the funding for the event. Thanks also to Jessica Townsend for administrative support and putting this together. If you are following from home on live stream, you can tweet any questions to Professor Abuasi at Abuasi. John Boyer sends regrets because an unavoidable conflict arose that he couldn't get out of. So our panelists tonight are in this order: Jenny Chandler, who is Vice President and Director of Network Support and Knowledge Sharing at the National Council of Nonprofits, a key infrastructure organization for the sector. Jenny comes with experience from both sides of the grant seeking and grant management equation, both in terms of serving on grant-making boards, but also in her current role in the National Council in terms of really advising nonprofits nationally on really relevant issues, both for grants, but particularly for government funding as well, and some of the major policy issues that have come up in recent years concerning that. Cindy Clay is Executive Director at HIPS, which is an organization that focuses on health rights and wellness in the DC city. And Cindy comes with a lot of experience in work, especially related to services and health and wellness services to sex workers and other individuals who are marginalized in the DC area or in urban populations. HIPS is an organization that depends heavily on government grants and as well as private foundation and donation supports. So Cindy, if you could tell us a little bit about from that side of the equation as well, especially in terms of how do you get the funding, how do you balance out both the grant seeking side and the grant management, as well as providing the services, especially from a pretty small organization such as HIPS. Rick Moyers is Vice President for Programs and Communications at the Meyer Foundation, which is a leader foundation here in the city and nationally in terms of funding capacity building for organizations. Rick has spent years at Meyer, but he wears many hats beyond the VP role. He's also been engaged in research in the sector. Some of the briefs that you've seen in class and read, including the Daring to Lead brief and Ready to Lead briefs Rick has been engaged with in putting out those reports. Rick, if you could speak to us, you're kind of the grant maker, one of the grant maker representatives here. If you could speak about, what does it look like from your side as well. And then Sherelle Hessel-Gordon is Executive Director of DC Rape Crisis Center, and Sherelle has years of experience in the field, especially dealing with sexual assault and with multiple organizations that serve individuals in that space. And Sherelle, if you could also speak to us, similar to Cindy, in terms of your experience working in human services and managing the grant seeking, as well as the management side. So thank you all for joining us tonight. And Jenny, would you like to begin?
Oh gosh, so not much more to add other than you'll see in my bio I did have an opportunity to serve as a trustee of a grant-making organization. It was an interesting foundation that was actually the result of two family foundations that merged. So it was relatively small nationally, but medium-sized for the state of New Jersey where it was located. And I also served on the board of the Council of New Jersey Grantmakers, which is an infrastructure group to support grant making either statewide or regionally. And I guess the kernel that I would share, and I'm sure that I get to go first, so it's going to be pathetic compared to the bold comments of my colleagues, but the kernel that I would share is if you are a grant seeker, to know your costs, and I'm sure we'll come back to that. So I'll just leave it at that, the little mystery.
Awesome, thank you. Hi, well, really glad to be here. I have been working for HIPS, which is here on the streets. We work with sex workers, drug users, and people in the street economies, and got to see the evolution of the organization from a primarily private-funded outreach and referral organization, where our budget was most comfortable around $250,000. Back when maybe that was more money than it is today. And then also kind of seeing the organization go through some pretty significant changes over our development over the past 22 years now at this point. I've been at the organization for 17. Seeing kind of the evolution of both loss of and minimalization of private funding due to many different aspects, including like a major recession and stock market issues, but then also changes in politics and shifts in foundation and kind of issue interest. And then even to this point where 5 years ago I was sitting with some of the major HIV and AIDS funders in the country who looked at a room of nonprofit HIV prevention leaders and said, half of you will be closed in 5 years. And so living now through the era of health reform and shifts in HIV prevention that are really changing what is funded both by government but also by private foundation sources. I think that if I had a tidbit of wisdom, it would be go into computers. I think that for us, it's been to, as HIPS has grown, like when I started, our budget was about $200,000. We're at 1.4 million now. Be flexible and be nimble. I think both in how you manage your programs and deal with programs and provide services, you have, at least with our clientele, you have to be very nimble to make sure that you're doing the best quality of services. But also in the sense of your grant making. Our one foundation or government grants interest 1 year is potentially not going to be that interest next year. And so many a times I've woken up to a funding stream completely disappearing overnight and having about 45 days to figure out what I'm going to do with that. To the point of what do I do with my staff, what do I do with my clients who are expecting those services. And I think that it is an inherent challenge in, nonprofit and social service effectiveness that we all deal with. So to be nimble and quick and to know both how to cut back, but also, how to relay that information to the people that you're serving or relay that to your constituency, and be prepared in as many ways to soften the blow.
May I ask a clarify? So you mentioned 45 days. Is that from when an RFP comes out, and then that's how long you have to respond, or is that just?
I mean, with DC government, that's being generous. With DC government, you might, like, sometimes they're gonna tell you if you have a grant or not 2 weeks before it starts and 2 weeks before your previous funding runs out.
Okay. Thank you.
That's fun.
So just a little bit more about the Meyer Foundation. Sometimes people find it interesting to know where the money comes from. So Eugene and Agnes Meyer were Don Graham's grandparents. They owned the Washington Post, and he made a lot of money on Wall Street. We've been around for 70 years, and we're one of the oldest and largest private foundations that's focused exclusively on this region. And right now, we fund in the areas of education, economic security, and healthy communities. And just to give you a sense of the competitiveness and kind of what it's like, we probably make about 150 grants a year. Each grant round, we're doing about 75 grants. We get 200 applications for those 75 grants. So it's less than half of all the requests that we receive move forward. The final thing I would say, because it might reflect on some comments or responses to questions later, is it's important to remember that when you're talking to someone from a foundation, you're talking to someone from one foundation. Foundations are really different and have different processes and different policies and different ideas. So the Meyer Foundation uses a 2-stage application process. So the first part of it is write us a 2-page letter and send us some attachments, and then we'll let you know if we're interested in that. So when I say things about proposals later, keep in mind that by the time you get to a proposal with us, we're pretty sure that we're going to fund it. We're just looking for information to build a case to the board. My tip would be, it actually is related to that, which is I think that people talk about grant writing a lot as if grant writing were a thing. And I don't, for us, but I actually think for many more foundations than you would think, the proposal is less important and less significant than you probably think it is. We fund organizations. We don't really fund proposals. The proposal is information that you're giving us in order for us to be able to justify the grant to the board, or to make a final decision about whether we think the grant is something we can make. But it's not really about the proposal. It's about our relationship with the organization and our assessment of its leadership, and whether what the organization does falls within our guidelines. And you can write a pretty terrible proposal and still get a grant.
Wow.
But no one should do that.
Is that comforting or is that alarming? I don't know if that's something.
To give a context to my kind of perspective, before I give you some tidbits, I've been doing Sexual Assault Coalition work and nonprofit work for about 20 years. And for a long time, I'd go from nonprofit to nonprofit, thinking that there was something wrong with me in regards to the structure of things. And it's not until I got my business degree that I understood the dynamics that occur in nonprofits. And so, one, graduate, right? So that's really important. But also, I think one of the strongest things that I consider, now being the executive director of the oldest rape crisis center in the country, is that part of being 43 years as an organization is that businesses evolve, right? And within the context of communities, we have to stay relevant, right? And then that is translated in how we have relationships with funders and how we then write and document that relevancy. So know your organization, don't mission morph, right? You want to build relationships with funders who understand your brand and understand the type of work that you do in real time, and that you are building a relationship. And then as part of that, you document it really well in regards to your communications and your grant writing. But don't mission morph, manage your brand really well, and know the infrastructure well enough so that you can be flexible and not solely dependent on one particular funding stream. And so if you diversify your funding base, which also means diversifying your relationships, then you can be a more healthy organization as you continue to evolve and grow and understand how your brand fits within the larger sector.
Wow, I'm really glad you guys emphasize relationships so much, and also diversification of revenue stream, because it's super important. Good.
We did that really well, by the way. I've been on many panels where people yeah,
Yay.
people did not honor their time.
Well, thank you very, so I'm gonna open it up, or we're gonna open it up to student questions first, and then, I'm sure that Professor Abuasi and I have some other additional questions along the way, but, so, student questions first. So if you could introduce yourself, say which program you're in, and.
Okay, my name is Joshua Weisbaum. I'm in the, I'm a medical program here, taking grant management. Mr. Moore, you were talking about valuing more relationships versus proposals. And you mentioned leadership as one of the aspects that you evaluate. What other aspects do you look at when looking at an organization, whether you're just deciding whether to fund them? In general sense.
Rick, before you respond, for miking purposes, do we need to repeat the question, or does that not matter to you? People at home. Okay, all right.
Thank you.
Okay, so the question, if I'm getting it, if I'm repeating it right, is kind of
What matters?
beyond leadership, what are the other things that we're looking at when we're deciding what to fund or what not to fund? So I shouldn't have made such a flippant comment about the proposal, because I think that the proposal or the application for funding is a reflection of the organization's capacity to do things. And so from that perspective, does it make a compelling case? Does the narrative make sense? Can I understand the financials? Did they understand what financials to include? Is there a budget that includes both income and expenses? Because a lot of times it just includes expenses. There are things like that that are about the proposal and the application itself that I think are important to our decision-making process. I really liked things that other people said. I think that we're looking for diversity of revenue. So our policy is to never be more than 10% of any organization's budget, or never be more than 10% of any project that we're providing support for. It's problematic. I saw that. Like a capital campaign.
Right.
We're not going to ever be more than 10% of a capital campaign. A couple things that I made notes about, and then I'll shut up. And I think you all should. You have philanthropy experience.
I do.
I think that one thing that people don't think about is that when we're reading applications, people often write the application or the proposal as if they're trying to justify that the program fits within our funding guidelines and priorities. And that's true, but the other question that I need to be able to answer from the proposal is why Meyer, why now? And that question is rarely written to in the proposals that I read. Any?
I like the why now comment, because particularly when you have a high number, when the ratio of applications for your generosity and the number of grants you can actually make there's a broad gap, you have to make some very hard choices. So why this particular proposal or this particular relationship gets it this year? And there are often foundations, there are also often times when the grant maker says, we gave to this school for the past 14 years. we love what they do, we think they're doing great work, but we really need to diversify our grant making and build our relationships with new organizations. I mean, not every foundation has that analysis, but it happens. And I think it's important for the grant seeker not to feel offended or upset when the grant maker that you may have had a relationship with asks you to take some time off. It's kind of like, good governance, you serve on a board for a number of terms, and then maybe you take some time off and come back on the board if you're really passionate about that organization, but you don't stay on the whole time. So, I don't know, I'll just throw that out, that I think there's an emotional response to being rejected, but there's thoughtfulness behind the why now. I hope.
So,
Hi, my name is Seth Gorenstein. I'm a second-year MPA student. I'm in Dr. Abuasi's grant management class. To build off your question, when talking about a relationship in this context, is the proposal the currency of the relationship, or the beginning point, or how else do you develop this relationship?
Go, Sherelle.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? It's almost like a suitor. You have to know the personality of the team or the foundation or the organization or the donor, right? So you do some research around what they're interested in. And maybe they only want you to approach them when asked. So you need to be aware of how they like for you to engage with them. I think also it's around, is it more important in the proposal versus the relationship? And if so, then you want to be really relevant. You want to invite them to all of your activities, or the really provocative ones, right? You want to keep them in the loop. How do they like to be kept in the loop, right? Do they like emails? Do they like handwritten letters? So it really is learning the space or the place or the person in a way so that you can really be intentional about the relationship. So that when the sector grows and it becomes more competitive, right, when the last straw happens, there's this thing that they can hold on to, saying, even though the sector is becoming more competitive and we've been doing this for 43 years, there's just something about DCRCC and the relevance in how they serve, right, that draws us to be able to continue to contribute, right? But you have to make that case before the drop of the proposal. I mean, at that point, the deal should be sealed. But it is an effort as a leader for you to continue to man those relationships, and, when you have all these other things on your plate, right? You have to be mindful about how you will manage your time. But it is very important, and a lot of EDs touch in different ways. Some EDs, stick with a really well-written proposal that lays out eloquently what they do, while others, use those more intimate touch points.
I think the work that the organization does and the impact that it has in the community is the currency of the relationship. And I think the proposal is just a way to convey that to us.
I'll be even a little bit more provocative and think about grant reports too, which is the sort of bookend of the relationship when you're reporting back. And I've gotten the distinct impression from some funders that I have relationships with that the report is just a check the box thing. And they don't, they're barely read, but unfortunately everything that's in them is important documentation. So they may be read at a later date, but they may not really contribute to the relationship or the grant maker's understanding of your programs. That comes more from, in some cases, from the conversations, from the site visits, from your writing, or whatever it is. So to be cynical, sometimes the proposal and the application or the report might be perceived as hurdles to jump through and sort of check the box maneuvers. Now I'm willing to have my head bitten off, but that is sometimes the perspective that the grant seeker has.
Cindy and Sherelle, could you mention, do these same lessons apply to government grants in terms of building relationships with government programs or individuals in
question.
government? How does this translate?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I mean, the world of, at least in my experience, the world of private foundations and government is so incredibly different.
Yes.
So incredibly different. And in government grants, at least from my experience, it really can be who hired the best grant writer. In DC, it is often not based on previous performance, and is solely based on who hired the best grant writer, on who gets the grant, or internal politics. And so that can be a challenge. Like HIPS, maybe 10 years ago, HIPS was actually we were probably about maybe a third HIV funding. We were a third kind of victim women's services funding, and then a third that was kind of like economic empowerment, sex worker specific type funding. And with the rise of the anti-trafficking movement, which happened about 10, 12 years ago, organizations like HIPS, who had come out from a human rights and a rights-based harm reduction perspective, became much less popular for the Office of Victim Services here in DC to fund. And so quickly, within about 3 years, we saw all of that money go away and to go to anti-trafficking organizations. Even though, in my humble opinion, we served 4 times as many victims, and had much better outcomes, right? And so with government grants, it's a big pot of money and you can get it more quickly. Or maybe not more quickly, but it's a much larger pot of money. And usually you can get it for 2 to 3 years, with some, not necessarily always in DC, but for federal, definitely. And it's really exciting and it's there. And you want to go after it. The challenge is that it's going to be really hard to develop a long-term relationship. Government people change jobs way more often than foundations do. The priorities aren't really governments to set, and there's politics involved. So even though I had a good relationship with the Office of OVS, someone, could just go and be like, how can you support this organization that says they're for sex workers' rights when we're trying to save people who are trafficked? And that alone can get an organization, or in my opinion, can get organizations cut out of funding regardless of what the actual services are. Where with private foundation grants, usually that's a longer term relationship. It's the impact that you can have in the community. And I mean, literally 12 months ago, I was faced with a emergency kind of like we have to move situation for HIPS. And it was my private funders that I could go to and say, okay, guys, I've been making all of these changes and doing all of these things that we have been saying that the sector needs to happen, and we're making these big changes. You told me to, and now I need your help because I need to do a capital campaign without having ever done one before. And I have to build out this new space because the regulations say that this is literally one of the only places in DC I can move my center because we do needle exchange and we have to be 1,000 feet away from a school, which in DC is practically nowhere. So it was my private funders who got on the phone and called up other private funders and called, other friends in philanthropy and said, hey, we need to make sure that this happens because we support the impact that this organization has. And even to the point where called other areas of government and said, what can we do to support this center? And those relationships, you're never going to get them. You're hardly ever going to get them with government, if you're ever going to get them. But the private funders, who have been with you for a long time, who even if they're not funding you right now, truly believe in your impact, will do that kind of work.
Thank you. Other questions?
My name is Adam Smith. I'm a second-year MPA student. And my question is for Sherelle. So you mentioned the need to diversify your funding streams and those relationships. I'm wondering how you do that, and also how you prioritize your time and your resources when they might have competing priorities, and how you also stay true to your brand while doing that.
Yeah, so how do you survive being an ED of a nonprofit, right? That's a whole semester. So one, I think you have to have some support in thinking. right? So a really strong board to help you manage and strategize, because you cannot be the only person holding the fundraising. Now, with a lot of nonprofits, they don't have the infrastructure or the capacity to have a development team. So you really have to be creative around what that looks like. So that's one thing. I think when you look at your own personal values and the values of the organization, you can set the tone in regards to your management of time. And so at DCRCC, it's very important for us to have self-care. We think about vicarious trauma all the time. And so I rely heavily on my director's team to, even though it might not necessarily be in their lane, to be thinking, right, and looking and searching and building relationships, understanding that everybody's connected to the overall goal of making sure that we're sustainable as an organization. Brand relevancy, that's just having your needle or having your kind of finger to the sector. Most of nonprofits that I've worked in that have an underlying theme of social justice grow out of a movement of some type of activism. And so you might not be, as an executive director, an advocate or an activist by trade, like in that that's what you call yourself, but somebody somewhere in your circle needs to be, so that you know in real time what's happening with your constituency, right? And so as that kind of bubbles up in your understanding of how to serve, you can continue to be relevant. Now, what happens a lot of times because of sector politics and funding, you might want to, again, mission morph, right? Because the resources are available and you have this really innovative idea of programming, and there's this funder that can give you $500,000 to do it. You have to be very mindful of that and grow steady and slow so that your infrastructure can be sustainable, not only from a financial standpoint, but from a personal standpoint, right? How much can you really do? And so, for instance, DCRCC's mission is to create a world free from sexual violence. That's pretty complicated, to end sexual violence, right? And so while we have a strategic plan and processes and everyone knows how they're connected to do that, I cannot hold that by myself. And so if you become an ED with this savior mentality around, I'm going to change the world solely, you will burn out quickly. So one, being mindful of yourself, relying on your team and a competent team that you're confident in, that you trust, right? Hire what you need, not what you like, right? And then have people in your circle that can provide an analysis around and can hold you accountable in being healthy in how you lead.
Jenny, I wonder if this might be a good time to reintroduce the idea of knowing your costs in terms of balancing your programs, your organization, protecting your infrastructure and capacity. In terms
Sure.
of could you talk briefly about
Yeah,
that?
so where I was coming from was, well, there are two aspects of this I'd like to introduce for you to think about and for maybe my colleagues to comment on. So I was starting from the grantee's perspective of knowing your costs, being transparent about your costs with your grantor, your funders, but also with yourself and your board and for your organization, because you may mission morph, or you may be tempted to, you may really want to go after this program, but it may actually cost you more to go in that direction than you will ever recoup. And particularly with government grants, historically, and I won't go into all the details, you can go to the National Council of Nonprofits website and take a look at our government contracting work, but historically, government grants have not covered the full costs of most nonprofits' services that they provide for governments. And that's because of a lot of things, but culturally, it's difficult to go to the government and say, hey, thanks for that money, but you didn't really pay me enough. So could I, that's a little scary to go to the source of your money and push back like that. So knowing your costs now is very, very helpful, because with new federal laws that are contained in the uniform guidance, which you may not have heard about, federal dollars, federal money that goes to pay nonprofits for services has to include a reimbursement for indirect costs. So these are costs that are not tied to a particular program. They're costs that are shared across different activities of the organization. And they're hard things to identify, like your insurance, turning the lights on in this room, like what program does that support? So as the nonprofit, it behooves you to figure that out. It's difficult work, but to figure it out, because there are avenues now to recoup some of that money, to negotiate with government for reimbursement. And then when you're working with private grant makers or even donors, I'm sure some of you have heard about the overhead myth or are aware that there's just a lot of cultural negative energy around funding administrative costs, which is too bad. It's frustrating because those costs are real. And so hopefully 5 years from now, 6 years from now, 10 years from now, we won't be having a conversation that connects bad with overhead. Instead, it will be true costs with what it really costs to deliver programs in the community. But there are unfortunately some private grant makers that absolutely won't fund anything that is an administrative cost, or they want you to have a certain overhead rate or whatever. And so nonprofits need to be brave to push back against that kind of thinking, and that's hard. It's really hard. So that's what I was talking about in terms of there's a whole exploration of the challenges, I think, of knowing your costs. It's cost allocation, it's accounting, it's really tough stuff, and it's a cultural shift, a mindset shift that needs to happen too.
Please.
I would also say, just in regards to government grant making, that sometimes what ends up happening, if you're an innovator, is that you're educating folks around what's appropriate, what the new law is, what's really allowable. And as the State Sexual Assault Coalition, largely we're educating funders around. And sometimes that includes a lawyer, sometimes it doesn't. It's a soft touch, but just in wanting to make it better for other nonprofits who might not have the capacity or the know-how, it's really knowing and understanding your sector and law around what you can do and what you can't do, so that when you propose something, you're able to justify it and say, here's what the practice is, and here's how we want to, and here's how it relates to the overall programmatic impact. But sometimes there are grant officers who just might not be aware, and it can be intimidating, but I think if you can be an innovator, particularly within your sector, in kind of setting the stage, it will impact other smaller nonprofits who will then get access to the resources that they need, and who can affect, change in the work that they're doing. Yeah.
So is that in terms of being very upfront about how much it will cost to produce a program?
Yeah, but I think
provide a program?
what I've tried to do sometimes, particularly with government funders, is when they come back and said, this is not allowable, then sometimes there's a teaching moment around, okay, so, can we talk about this? What this is, let me show you how this impacts our bottom line and how it's integrated into our programmatic, and maybe I didn't present it right. Maybe there's a better way to do it. Maybe I can't get this resource now, but can we talk about whether it's allowable or not? Can you help to inform me around how you got that mindset or what it looks, right? So it's not combative, but it's around, one, educating us if we got it wrong, but also educating the funder if they have a different perspective that might not be true to work in real time for a nonprofit and what the law says. Does that make sense?
So allowable in terms of overhead or other expenses that might be in the proposal?
Yeah, so this term allowable or unallowable is a technical term of indirect costs. So the government has decreed that there are certain allowable costs and certain non-allowable costs. So lobbying is not allowed, but,
Right.
other things are. So I think that's what you're referring to,
Yeah,
Cheryl.
but I'll give an example. So if a funder is used to a particular type of organization in a sector that might actualize an allowable cost in a particular way, and DCRCC and HIPS and how we operate might be grassroots and totally different. And so when we communicate that, it might not look the way that the funder has largely seen it. And so immediately they'll say, no, I'm not going to allow it, right? And so for sometimes executive directors, we can say, so I understand that this is not allowable. Can I tell you more about how this could be allowable and how it is integrated into our work that might seem different because we're a different organization, different type of organization in how we operate.
Rick, does this same lesson apply to what you see in terms of, from the grant making perspective on the private side?
Yes. I think that the issue on the private foundation side, I think, is just as much nonprofits don't know how to account for their costs and recover their costs by asking for the right amount of money as it is any reluctance on the part of private foundations in general to pay a certain overhead rate. I did some survey work on this maybe 5 to 7 years ago. This is kind of indirectly related because I surveyed a group of other funders about whether they would be willing to support campaigns for operating reserves. And the answer that I got from them was a lot of confusion because they don't support capital campaigns. Well, it's not a capital campaign, it's a different kind of thing. But also that just no one ever asked for that. And so I think that there's a lot you can do. I don't think you should assume that people at private foundations understand how nonprofit finances work. I don't think that you should assume a predisposition against overhead or certain rates of overhead, although you should certainly be prepared to find it if you run across it. But I don't think you should assume going into the conversation that your overhead rate needs to be as low as possible.
Right.
And when I have this conversation with my colleagues who work at other foundations, what I say is I think that we need to start really seriously challenging the idea that you can run an effective organization at 5% overhead or 10% overhead. Because I do not believe that it's possible for you to run a good organization on that level of overhead. So either you're lying or you have a terrible organization. And we need to be having those conversations so that people can understand the true costs of doing business. And those costs need to be written into grant proposals.
Thank you.
Can I?
Yes, please.
So I think that really tied to this point is the fact that I might be a little jaded. I don't think that everyone who truly believes in a cause should run a nonprofit. I don't. I feel like people who truly believe in a cause and who are, good at advancing or dealing with that cause should be involved in the cause, right? But nonprofits they're a business, right? It's money in, it's money out. Now, it's business with a very different format of doing business, right? Like, the sooner I started running HIPS when I was very young. I took over, very young. I took it over after watching 2 other executive directors before me run it into the ground because of poor fiscal management. And at 23, I was like, I know at least as much as the person who quit, and then I had to lay off 7 of my friends. Right? That was my first thing I did as ED of HIPS. It was fabulous, super fun. But they're businesses. And if you don't kind of make sure that you're looking at all the sides of it, you can't sustain doing good program work. And like you said earlier about having a good team that supports you as ED, if you're the one who's doing everything and you feel like you have to, work, we did this with our staff recently. Like, one of the things that we did was we tied everybody's annual reviews to the goals and objectives that they were actually working on for the grants and the other projects that we wanted to have. Because what we were trying to help people think about is when you come into the nonprofit sector, people want to help. They want to do good work. They want to make a change in the community. And often the way we translate that in our society is that I'm working really hard. I'm super stressed out. I can't get any sleep. And so therefore I must be making a difference because I'm sacrificing and taking one for the team. And that's not necessarily always how it works. I mean, sometimes it is, right? And God bless the people who are doing both in some senses, but it's not sustainable over time. And so moving from like, we're just working hard and we get paid crap and we have crap benefits and, none of us have had raises in 10 years and,
No, wait a minute, we want them all to come be leaders in the sector. We don't want to scare them away.
But so when you go without that mindset, right? When you kind of move into the fact of this is what we need to take care of both the organization and ourselves, and knowing that for real is where you really kind of get the real change and in a way that's sustainable and isn't just focused on one martyr or one person. And I think that knowing what your costs are, being able to pay your rent, those kinds of things are really, really critical when you're looking at the field. I mean, if you're gonna go into business, this is the best kind of business to go into, in my opinion. But it's still kind of keeping an eye on that business side is really, really important.
Thank you.
I guess my question is for Mr. Morris, but the whole panel as well. So you said that you give about 75 grants for the applications. Is that correct?
That's fair.
Yeah. So is that consistent then? Like maybe perhaps you give this shit, or that like what percentage of people that apply for a grant actually get the grant? Does that? I mean, I'm sure.
So the question was, what percentage of applications or people or organizations that apply for a grant get the grant? And I will answer that from my limited experience, but also from my grant-seeking experience, that it totally depends on the foundation, because there's some foundations with very narrow missions and scopes, and what does success look like for them is pretty defined. And so they're going to attract fewer, if they're doing their job well, they probably should attract fewer actual proposals, because they will have communicated to the world that we're only interested in funding X, Y, and Z, so please only apply if you need X, Y, and Z, or whatever. So, does that make sense?
I would also say that I couple it with almost like academia in regards to the application process. So different schools have kind of different ways of seeking and courting and getting applications. Some are more competitive than others, some have different spots than others, some have larger supports than others. And so it really just depends on the foundation and or grant-making institution. Yeah.
So how many no's you got on a grant proposal versus how many yeses?
In 20 years,
Yeah. Or last year or than the last year?
I would say on my team. I would say that we might apply for 75 in a year, and we might get 45 to 50. And again, it also depends on the life cycle of the organization. So if you're branding a new program, or if you're rebranding the whole organization, if you have, changed EDs, all of that kind of messes with the relationship and has you to kind of hit restart or not, depending on the life cycle of the business.
Yeah.
And in our case, we, the numbers are much smaller all around, but we barely ever are turned down, because by the time we get to a proposal, we have had so many conversations with the funder that they're inviting us to apply, and they're basically, the proposal is sort of something we need in our file, but we know we're going to support you. So it's just different on the type of organization. But I think the way to answer that as someone just breaking into the field is assume you need more proposals in the pipeline than that will end up with
Yes.
beyond your goals for your budget, because not all of them are going to get funded.
Yeah,
Right,
yeah.
yeah.
Chuck?
Yeah, you all kind of mentioned this briefly earlier, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about this kind of communication gap that can sometimes occur between foundations and the nonprofits, and kind of how on the grant seeding side do you kind of build in for things like overhead risk, the kind of things that nonprofits are often scared to talk about, and then on the grant giving side, how do you kind of work around that if you know that that's going to be something that's not going to be brought up in those conversations during the application process?
I'll have two stories I'll share. One is, and I'm sorry that I keep talking, but I'll say my piece and then be quiet while these guys are thinking. There is a foundation that I know that asks on its application, and the bulk of its application is, what should we be asking you that we haven't? And, what do you need to tell us that we haven't asked? So that's a way to bridge it. And then also on the communication gap, take a look at the Nonprofit Finance Fund's report called State of the Sector. And there are some questions that they've asked consistently over the past, I'd say, 4 years, if not longer, about how easy it is to talk with your grant makers about your finances, or how hard it is, I should say. In other words, are you really fully disclosing the pain points and your challenges? Or are you sharing with your grant makers and your donors, oh, everything's rosy, give us more money because everything's rosy? Or are you having the candid conversation saying, you know what, we need to moving expenses, and we need to build it out, and that's not something that we can get from anywhere else. It's not covered in any government grants, so can you share some ideas on how we can get through this challenging time? So I think more and more enlightened grant makers want to have those candid conversations. They want to hear the challenges. They want to understand what you're dealing with. So
The dreaded sustainability section of the grant proposal.
We don't have that.
Thank God. I think one of the earlier lessons I learned, especially with privates, but also sometimes with government, is just to be honest about what's going on. I mean, again, if your programs are solid and if your reputation is solid, then because you run good, effective programs, you can describe their outcome. Going to a funder and being like, hey, I know you funded us for this, and this was our idea. 3 months into it, it's a mess. It's not working at all. We'd like to try something different. We think that these are the problems, we've looked at it, we'd like to shift our focus a little bit in a way that we still feel fits in line with your priorities. And to a T, I've never had anyone say no, but that comes from doing the homework and knowing both, being able to know what's not working, but also being able to know how you could shift it so that it still falls within something that your funder is interested in.
it's complicated for foundations to take money back. They'd much rather you redeploy it, keeping them posted on how it's being redeployed.
I think, so I'm going to take a pass on part of the question because we give mostly general operating support, and so I have to admit that I don't closely scrutinize how organizations tell us they're going to spend the money, because it's general operating support and they can spend the money on anything they want to spend it on. So if they happen to put a budget with it, I don't go back to them and try to negotiate about the budget or suggest that they should ask for a different thing. I can say one of the most surreal experiences that I ever had was talking to an organization that was asking us for funding, and I said, don't you think you should build in some overhead, or this grant is not large enough? And them say, and the grantee replied, no, our overhead is built into the staff salary rate that we're charging for the grant, which I believe was true, but the grant ultimately ended up going over budget, and so it would have been great if they had had that extra cushion. And I just thought it was so bizarre that I would suggest that an organization ask for more overhead, and they would say, no, we're fine, it'll be fine. And it turned out not to be fine.
Right.
So, I mean, read, if a funding source allows you to put in an amount for overhead, for goodness sake, put in the maximum amount allowed overhead that is available for that particular funder. Because provided you have some documentation to support that level of overhead.
I mean, it was interesting, before the panel start, we were talking about who gets attracted to being in philanthropy, right, as their career choice, versus, and folks that get attracted to nonprofits, right? And largely what we see in the pool is folks have a passion, and there's an opportunity that comes available. And then that's coupled, and they think that they're going to change the world, whether they're a volunteer hotline advocate to an ED, that there is going to be impact. And I think in understanding the parameters and boundaries of what a nonprofit can do, right, in affecting a particular cause, and then how a nonprofit can couple with other folks to do the work, and then intermingling in a way with people that are doing philanthropy or working at foundations so that that bridge is connected. I value when foundations provide the opportunity to engage with nonprofits, not in a funder and, grantee kind of way, but in a, here's what's happening in the community, and here's what we're doing, but we're partnering and talking with you as another community member. I think largely we put caps and roles on people, and so they always operate in that role. But I think better communication happens, I've seen in different states, when folks are just able to understand the work and that it translates from nonprofit to foundation or funder in a way that is human, right? And it's not to say that we're not, but largely if I'm the ED of DCRCC and you're the Meyer Foundation Program Officer, and that's the only way that you get to engage and understand the work at DCRCC, you miss out on all of the ways that we touch the district, right, and how we serve. And you miss the language, right, and being informed and being equipped to engage in how we do the work. And when folks don't have literacy or shared literacy, then it's hard to communicate, right? And so just as much as a grantee, we want to learn the foundation's literacy, finding opportunities, creating opportunities for foundations to also learn your literacy, I think helps with cross-cultural, cross-translation, and getting your work actualized and seen to be relevant to get funded.
If I could push back, sure, I totally agree with you,
Mhm.
but I'm putting myself in the position of a young or a new development director, and I'm looking at the Foundation Center directory and reading and researching grants. How am I going to have a conversation with a program officer so that I can have that shared? I love that concept of shared literacy, but I think it's daunting.
I think it also has to do with my personality, right? So you got to know your skill sets, right? So I am personable. I am great at relationship building. That's one of my great skill sets. And so I find it to be welcoming to have an opportunity. When I first got to be the executive director of DCRCC, one of the first things I did was, hey, I need to know all my program officers, so I need one-on-ones, I need you to come by, I need you to come to our events, right? So I am wanting to build that relationship. So yes, there are some new, directors who might not necessarily have that skill set. I do, however, think that it's valuable. So if you don't hold it, who in your house does, right? Whether it's your volunteer base that's dynamic, that can build that literacy, or it might just be a media campaign, right, that builds that literacy. I think in order for you to change behavior, right, and move people to engage, they have to be informed to do so. And whoever's informing, right, whether it's you or someone else, I think that has to happen in order to be able to translate your organization. So.
Good advice. Good advice.
Other questions? Rebecca?
So I have two questions, one on funding and the other on the management side of things. For funding, is there like additional scrutiny for grant seekers who are starting nonprofits, or like a startup nonprofit, from the foundation side, and then I guess from the nonprofit side? I'm not sure if you all have been there from the startup, but from inception, like would you say that there's additional scrutiny when it comes to funding? And then my second question is, on a personal level, I'm in the private sector and I've been trying to transition to nonprofit. And I just want to know what culturally do you think would be, I guess, is there resistance to people that come, because there's clearly a difference in culture, right, from private to nonprofit, but what are some things that you can, I guess, use to transition, and some skill sets that you can leverage in the management side of things?
Two good questions. If I could take the first one, which is about startup nonprofits. We're hearing at the national level that a lot of attorneys that represent foundations are advising them not to make grants to brand new organizations that have started since the IRS has started its 1023-EZ, which is a fast, expedited process for starting a nonprofit. And that's because when the IRS implemented this newer, faster track recognition process of recognition of tax exemption, the service also shortened the amount of time it takes, which is great, but it also reduced the amount of scrutiny. And so they're very conservative attorneys are saying your foundation, private foundation, you may be at risk if you give a grant here. Now, that may be overreacting, but that just gives you a sense of the concern about a newly hatched nonprofit where the grant maker may decide that there isn't enough education here, there's not enough of a track record, I don't have the assurances that this organization is going to, A, be operating with good governance practices, or B, make it. So I think there's sort of two aspects of that concern. So I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news if you're about to go out and start a nonprofit, but it may be tough for you because of that.
Could I follow up? So would it be in the organization's interest, even as a young startup and small, to fill out the full 1023
Interestingly,
to get exempt status, and then the full 990?
Really good question. Interestingly, the determination letter that the service is issuing does not give you a hint as to what the process was. The organization could have filed the longer form and had a little bit more scrutiny, or it could have filed the easy checklist. So it's just that a foundation with the resources, with program officers' time and interest could pursue it and ask you questions. But there are many foundations that are receiving so many applications for proposals that they don't have time to do one-on-one scrutiny of a newly formed organization. And again, that is a personal preference. There may be other foundations that have no problem with that.
And there are also grant makers who own startups.
Yeah, exactly.
So
Incubation spaces, and yeah, that's a very good point. So anyways, more on that if you want after the class. Fascinating question about culture of for-profit, turning it into a new chapter in a nonprofit. What are the skills expertise, cultural competencies that you have from the for-profit world that you would bring to the nonprofit world. So I'll throw those at my colleagues on the panel. Throw that question.
I love hiring people from corporate.
Me too.
I mean, at HIPS, we don't get to do it all that often, but when it happens, it's pretty fabulous. I do think that, so I have seen, at least in the HIV and AIDS field, which is where HIPS has primarily been for the past, 7, 8 years, management experience, hiring someone who has probably 2 to 3 years actual management experience, not direct service, not running programs, but actually managing people who run programs, is an extreme challenge in our field. And so people who, like, highlighting management experience is a good skill that translates well. I would love to do that. And I also feel like for us, the people who have made the transition either were just lucky enough to have the skill set that we needed at that time, or they had some pretty extensive and awesome volunteer experience that made me feel like they would understand the culture and the issue, right? And we've also heard that from other agencies who have hired. We have a really extensive, we have about 100 volunteers, and a super extensive and super intensive volunteer program. And all the time I hear about, like, just other agencies that would hire specifically because because of the volunteer experience that they do. Makes your skills a lot more easily translatable if you can highlight that.
Yeah.
Well, I actually want to come back to the first question. So if you were going to talk to the...
Nope, you got it. I can hold it.
I've been thinking about this ever since you asked. So I don't know if I would say that there's additional scrutiny to startups. We're disinclined to want to fund a startup, just kind of on principle, because we're already turning down 60% of all the organizations that apply to us. And so you would have to have a super compelling community need that is going unmet, that you are the only person who does this. And I can give you one of the last new startup-ish organizations that Meyer funded is an organization called Generation Hope. Do any of you know it? It's an organization that matches individual donors with young parents so that they can, parents who have kids while they're in high school, so that they can continue
And stay in school.
Through college, which was it was an interesting business model because it's really about individual donors who are both contributing to that student's education and playing a mentor role in their life, and there's a huge need, and we were not aware of anyone else who was doing that. But actually, in the case of that organization, we watched them for 3 or 4 years, basically for proof of concept. And we figure, okay, if you can make it for 3 or 4 years and you're up now, you're serving 100 students, then maybe that would be a good investment for us. And I just think there's so many nonprofits, it's so competitive. I just think you want to be really, really sure that you want to start an organization.
I would say a benefit sometimes is to have fiscal sponsorship or partner with other established nonprofits, or start as a program instead of growing out a nonprofit set aside. So that's one thing in regards to kind of getting resources. The other thing that I've seen that's been successful is grow your base, so individual donorship, right? To see your organization, who are wedded to your mission, those donors can really help to support you through thick and thin of the growth of your organization. And in regards to transferring from the corporate sector, it's interesting, nonprofit EDs and hiring managers, we look for great candidates, and so we have our own kind of network around, hey, I know someone looking, do you have something? So one in the know, ask for kind of mock interviews with EDs if you like a particular organization. You know, ask for 15 minutes of their time to be able to talk to them about your skill set and how you think it's a match. Some EDs will do that. And then volunteer. That's the best way to get into a nonprofit, because if you're serving and then EDs or hiring managers can see how you fit within the overall culture, we're more likely to pull from our base that we already have instead of hiring fresh out of the pool. Idealist is great. Isn't it Idealist? Yeah, it's really great. So then also looking at the kind of job boards that listservs that nonprofits, coalitions that nonprofits are connected to, because we don't use the traditional job processes to get great candidates. It's who you know, who's in your building, and do you come with impeccable references that can provide you with almost like street cred, right? To be able to do the work. And then what I would say for you in regards to transitioning, I know it might seem like a glorious fantasy to work in a nonprofit, but be prepared around sustainability. Most folks burn out at 3 years. And so, you know, make sure you have your self-care and support system intact. Largely, you're underpaid and overworked, but you're doing it for a really great cause, and you can make some wonderful connections and some really deep impact. But that's what you outweigh when you jump to kind of the corporate to the nonprofit. It's phenomenal, but there is a sacrifice. And so what I say for people that are coming into the sector is be prepared to know what you're willing to give up or willing to give.
Hi, so my name is Elise Roberts, and I am auditing this course on grant management. I'm currently the Vice President of Operations and Development at Mentors of Minorities in Education, or MOMI CLC. We are a past awardee of the Meyer Foundation, and we really thank you for your support. And I have 400 million questions for all of you, but one that has been really relevant in our work and my work specifically lately is I just completed a grant report for the Meyer Foundation for our capacity building and technology capacity building grant. And what Cindy was talking about in being honest with your grant reporting and with the transition, we had our executive director leave at the beginning of October. So there's been a lot of transition with that, and seeing a bunch of different areas of capacity where we need help. And so in writing these grant reports, how honest should we be? How should we paint the picture where it's everything's crazy and we're all up in arms with this transition, or should we say that the program is going swimmingly, which on the program side it is going swimmingly, and the children are really benefiting from the services that we provide. But where is the balance between being super honest and painting a picture of what the children are benefiting from our program?
Which strategy did you take when you wrote up?
Yeah, you have to find the proposal.
It might be in my bag. I think so. I think that you don't want to be disingenuous. Well, people are a lot of the time, and I think particularly, you know, if we gave you capacity building support, we want to know whether that grant built capacity or not. We assume that everything's going great for the kids, and so there's no. I don't think there's a way to pivot and say, we're having these organizational issues, but everything is great for the kids, if the grant was specifically a capacity building grant. And I think that I guess I'm surprised. We have a lot of staff vacancies right now, so I get a lot of phone calls that I wouldn't normally get. And I guess I'm surprised at how many phone calls I get from people who want to know, you know, my grant report is due on Friday, and I want to know if it's okay if I submit it on Monday instead, which is not a call anyone ever needs to make to the Meyer Foundation. And the relatively small number of calls that I get from people saying, I just, you know, I wanted you to know that our executive director left, and kind of talk through what the implications are, which was kind of a roundabout way of saying,
Help.
if something has happened that you think is really significant and you don't exactly know how to write it into the grant report, pick up the phone and call us. Because I would much rather have that conversation than to tell you, yes, you can have 3 more days to send in your final report. And I don't want to come off, I really appreciate it that people are so diligent that they don't want to miss our final report deadline. I really do. But just don't miss the deadline. I mean, you're creating like a little negative interaction with the foundation that is unnecessary. And if I'm going to talk to you, I would rather talk to you about something real that is significant about your organization. And I'm sorry if any of you have ever made a call like that and I've talked to you.
I would also say that losing a leader, whether it's your board chair or your ED, is a huge life cycle event for an organization, creates enormous amount of vulnerability, brings up all kinds of things for me in fundraising, which is sometimes just the ED is the only one who holds the relationships, and when that person leaves, then what? You're starting, from the scratch again. So that's when you do pick up the phone and you call all your funders, not just the ones that you have a grant report due that week on, in my view. This is something that's really important for them to understand. Now, that begs the question, do you call all your major givers and do you call every single donor? No. But this, in terms of the stability of an organization, transition of leadership could be planned transition, and it still creates vulnerability. So it's just a big deal.
Can I also say that I think foundations want to hear your challenges.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want to hear your problems.
Mm-hmm. So they want to understand that your challenge may be another grantee's challenge.
Right.
Could be the whole charitable sector's challenge, which they may not have a window to see unless there's a dialogue about it.
Well, and I had a funder say to me, like, it's better that I want you to stop apologizing for A, B, and C, right? I just need you to run good programs, and I need you to let me know that you're handling this and you have a plan, right? And this was a funder that I was I was terrified. Every time they called me, like, I broke out in like a cold sweat. I'm like, oh my God, I have to talk to this person. They're gonna be like, everything's a little bit of a mess right now. They're gonna be so disappointed. And it was actually a really nice kind of evening the playing field, because like when things happen, like, right, and sometimes things get really messy in the nonprofit world, and that's okay. From my experience is, this happened. It's a gigantic mess. Here's our plan. Here's what we need help with. Here's how you can help. Those are the things that funders really, from my experience, have been much more positive in reacting to me than me being like, oh my God, this happened. Or oh my God, like, this is going on and this is going on and this is going on. It's more about here's the plan and here's the outcome, just like your goals and objectives.
That's an example of leadership in action. Cindy's modeling for you the type of employee I want to hire, not someone who says, oh, we have a problem, but someone who comes to me and says, well, we have a problem, but here's the plan. Here's what we're going to do, and here's how you can help. So thank you, Cindy. That's good.
lastly, what I would just add is that, look at your funder as a partner. And if you were partnering, what would you want to know,
Mm-hmm.
right? What information would you want to know in your limited amount of time that you're giving in your partnership? And I think when we're in the thick of things, we think everything is bad. So is it that their investment didn't see any type of light, right? So I think communicate specifically the challenge, the need, and what your plan is, but think about what you would want as a partner to know in order to move forward in the relationship.
We've actually taken to calling our major supporters our mission partners. We just feel like we want, even if they're not acting like that, we want to sort of plant the seed that they're our partners. So thank you, Sherelle, for that.
You spoke earlier about how executive directors are often the people that hold the relationships between the funders and the organization. What kind of roles can and should board members of organizations play with funders, especially the board members that might serve on multiple boards that kind of serve as a nexus of
Yeah.
a relationship?
Great question. I think we should ask Mr. Board Source to answer that one.
I think that board members are deeply problematic relationship holders for funders like us. The most recent transaction I was involved with, in which a board member of an organization tried to insert themselves, was terrible and didn't get funded. I mean, so that, and this was a significant organization and a board member with significant political connections. I think where board members are useful are for like people that they know that would not otherwise be in the orbit of the executive team, or for like small private foundations or family funds that don't have any staff, that are really people who can just write checks because someone suggests that they do. But I think for Meyer Foundation kind of fundraising, I think we like to see board members a lot, from time to time, but we don't want the board member to be the holder of the relationship. And I thought when you started the question, I thought you were going to ask about development directors. And why shouldn't the development director be the holder of the relationship? And I think there's an issue there. So right or wrong, we like to talk to the executive director because we like to talk to the person who's in charge of the organization, and we find we have better, more strategic and better informed conversations when we talk to the executive director. Maybe we're chewing up a lot of executive directors' time with our unnecessary meetings, and we should be talking to more development directors. I think that one of the biggest complaints about from both development directors and from younger people coming up in the leadership ranks is that executive directors won't share their networks and relationships. And so I think that if I were coming up as a development director, I would want to have a chat with the person that I was working for about, like, what is the process over the course of a few years for you to engage me in some of these relationships. And we like meeting with executive directors, but we don't forbid development directors from coming to meetings. But I'm surprised at how there's not that there are a lot of executive directors who don't make it a point to try to tell us to get to know their development directors. And I don't know if it's just because they're stretched really thin and they can't, like, use two people's time in one meeting, or whether it's rooted in just such a strong sense of ownership over those relationships.
I think for us, it's all around function. So we're beginning to try to create a culture of fundraising, and that depending on your lane or your job, you have a function by which you engage. And so for a board member, for us, we think of convener, facilitator, conduit to bridge relationships. But again, the function would be for the executive team to manage and hold those relationships, and then the programmatic team down to the volunteers actually implement the strategy and or connection to the other levels of contributors to the overall mission of the organization. So I think when you have a culture of fundraising that includes everyone from the bottom layer to the top, then it manages succession and transition planning a lot more effectively, so that your board members feel like they're contributing and they have a clear functional role in fundraising, but then also your staff feel like that they could also contribute in their overall processes for managing what they're contributing to. So that's just how DCRCC is growing to do that.
It is a great book, and I can't think of the name, but it's in the past 3 years, it's talking about the culture of fundraising and shared leadership on that, and that's ideal.
My question is, how do you avoid mission creep or mission morph and still be able to evolve? And specifically, I'm in an agency that desperately needs to change their mission, but we want to stay true to the core values. So how do you
I think it's healthy for organizations to do strategic planning around every 5 years. And in that process, have different levels of engagement with constituents, boards, and staff around the sector, the need, the movement, right? And so if the value is around responding to the need, and then there is a systematic way in which you analyze what the need is and how you contribute, I think naturally, not your mission necessarily evolve, but how you implement and work out your mission and the way and the activities will evolve. I think if there are problematic words, right? If you're wordsmithing, that's one thing. I think, from a brand management perspective, you can do that. I think if you're talking about changing the whole organization, it might mean that the organization doesn't need to change, and maybe you. And I mean that in a good way, because there's some organizations that are rooted in what they're going to do, and they won't evolve to respond to a need, and that's okay. But then as a contributor to that, you can make the decision to want to contribute to that issue in a different way. I think so many times we get stuck in this nonprofit needing to be something for us, or complete or actualize this for us because we're wedded to the issue. When there's many ways to contribute to an issue, and so I think you need to look at organizations who are healthy in that way, that are constantly reevaluating themselves to meet the need and the issue that they're set out to do. And whether you bring it up or it's a function of their process, and it takes time. Nonprofits are growing, living, breathing things because people are in it that are growing, living, and breathing, and there are needs that are constantly changing and evolving. And sometimes, people don't know what they know in order to think differently. It takes a long time for behavior to change, right? So that's just my take.
So, just to put things in perspective, we had this discussion in class about the mission creep and so on. It's not about the need of in the community and how you evolve. We were talking about the funding and how much the funding actually would lead to mission creep. And Cindy, you started this panel by saying you as a nonprofit need to be flexible. So again, flexible to what extent?
Yeah.
I mean, flexible around the how, but
The why and the impact, right? I mean, so HIPS just went through, like, we went through an entire mission, we've gone through a couple of mission changes over our 20-year history. And each time, I mean, one of those was an entire 180. We were formed as an abolitionist organization to get 18-year-olds off the street. And then in 1997, we just realized that, actually we were a harm reduction organization that was going to work from a human rights perspective to help everybody who was in street economies. And each time we've done that, it came from a result of looking at what we were doing, asking if we were having the impact we wanted to, and then redefining what we did and kind of, not how we did it, but what our goal was as an agency based on both what was happening in the community, what the need was, and what the environment was like. And we had to do it looking at each of those three things. Most recently, like our second big change was we changed from being a sex worker, like serving /right/ by and for organization to an organization that also served drug users who didn't do sex work. And that came from a recognition of the other organization who primarily served injection drug users had just closed. And the fact that those clients were already coming to us and we were serving them well anyway, and there was this huge need in the community that wasn't going to, that was very similar to what we were already doing. And so a slight expansion wouldn't take away from our sex working clients, but would fill this huge gaping need for services in the community. Being flexible is not the same as being like, I can do that, I can do that, I can do that. There's a whole pile of money out there, I mean, I have a program that I love and adore that I have shopped around as an employment program, as a reentry program, as an HIV/AIDS program. Like, the core component of the program still, is intersectional, and sometimes funding is not intersectional, which is really, really hard. But I do that with the integrity to know that I'm not just telling them what they want to hear. Like, I'm really pulling out the pieces of that program that address those social determinants so that I can fund this program that I know is going to have a huge impact for the people that I'm working with.
Yeah.
Let me ask a related question. So how do you, as you get, for instance, with HIPS or in DCRCC, if you get specific funding streams that grow your organization really quickly in particular programs such as HIV/AIDS, how do you hold on to or preserve the aspects of your programs that might not get funding, like advocacy and representation?
It's huge. It's such a struggle. I would actually say you have to be willing to grow at a pace that you can consciously hold if the funding doesn't come. And that the positions and the infrastructure are flexible enough to be able to be relevant to the contribution of other parts of the agency, right? So it's almost like for our public policy and advocacy team, there are definitely resources that are available for like lawyers and to bring on a whole bunch of lawyers, and that has a high overhead, right? As opposed to growing out a program that might be one lawyer but a lot of law students, right? So we balance kind of what can we hold if it doesn't ever happen, and then what can we manage based on the need, and we try to grow that slowly. Historically, we have not done that. Over time, in our 43 years, we've gotten these resources, and we've had 30, 40 and I'm exaggerating, maybe more like 30 staff, and then funding, because of our fiscal year, the next year we don't get the funding, and then we have to go down to 15. And that's devastating to community, right? And so I think as much as the resources out there, sometimes we have to say no, that we can't grow that way, and we can't carry that if you take it away next year. And so I think if we're steady in our collaboration, so the other thing is that if HITS is doing intersectional work and touching some of our, the way in which, that maybe I want to share that load so that, maybe FTE or a full-time person might take half, and then your person takes half. We still do the work, but we're not carrying the load as an organization by ourselves. And so what we're finding is that a lot of our issues are intersectional, right? And a lot of oppression is intersectional in the social justice work that we do. And so if I can get the resource and share it or collaborate or do coalition work together so that we can all actualize our missions, I think executive directors are becoming really savvy about collaboration and flexibility in job descriptions, so that we don't have to jump. I mean, we've seen it all the time. The sector will pop up with all these different nonprofits, and because the resources are out there. But communities are getting kind of fatigued and frustrated with programs that are funded and they infiltrate communities, and then the resource dies up, and now it's gone. And so we want to be intentional about impact in a gradual way that's sustainable, and that's respectful, respectful to the community that we live in and that we serve, and for some of us who we're a part of.
I think what you're hearing is the examples of being nimble and rethinking job descriptions, rethinking shared, work, collaborations, rethinking the way work is done. So that's the nimble, flexible stuff, but with a core focus on what the mission always was. But we heard you say the mission has to change, so I think that has to happen at the board level.
And sometimes, though, the mission can change, but the values don't have to, right? So if the core values are something that you can hold strong to, it's kind of like you changing clothes, right? You're still the essence of that person. You just changed, the different way in which the world might experience you.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. If there's not one from the audience, okay.
I'm Jasmine. I'm also a student here for Dr. Carlin's class, and I am in the Masters of Public Administration program. My question is about management. So how do you actually manage 50 or plus grants that you get, or make it year to year? How does that process look like if you don't have a development department?
Yeah, so I don't have a development department. I break it out in function. So I have some directors who are just researching. I have other directors who are formulating budgets every day to respond. I might be, or other directors might be managing the relationships. I might have an associate who actually uploads or makes sure that it actually gets to the person it needs to get to. I might have someone who runs the checklists around whether all of the things are in the proposal. I mean, we also have a very extensive volunteer pool, and we rely a lot on our volunteers to do some of that administrative work. And then as a team, the directors, we kind of figure out, here's what we think we want to do and the activities that we want to do this year as it relates to our strategic plan. Let's find out who is funding that. And so it might not be that the proposal changes drastically because we're doing kind of the work and we're just trying to find resources to support that in different parts or ways. So the other thing is not recreating the wheel, and so we're not writing 50 brand new proposals. They all have the same essence. And then the other thing is just make sure that in your team you have good writers, right? So some person could just be editing. One person might be conceptualizing and building the bones. I mean, I rely on my staff. And I trust them. Yeah.
When you mentioned directors share the work among directors, is that board of directors or is that your
No,
program director?
my program directors,
Yeah.
I have a deputy director, and then I have three other directors. Each one of them have a particular skill set, and so we literally just break up the work. And for small nonprofits, that happens a lot, that you have your lane, but a lot of times you're all in somebody else's lane because it's not feasible for one person to carry it with an organization that's trying to impact in a particular way, so, yeah.
About how much time out of your days would you say, or out of your week would you say, goes to the proposals and submitting and following up on grants?
It's seasonal for me. So come January, I'm in a cave writing, right? Come August, September, I'm in a cave, right? But then there's a lull in the summertime, right? So it's like,
I had 3 due on Friday. I have
Yeah.
3 due on Friday.
she has 3 due on Friday, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Time for.
So it's like you go in a
Yeah.
cave and you, well, for me, I can't write with a lot of distractions. So you go in a cave and you hammer it out because you know you got 3 due on Friday.
And I have a different approach, which is, so I'm not our CEO is the one that holds a lot of the relationships and that drives it. But in my fantasies, he spends 1 day a week just cultivating relationships and picking up the phone, and it doesn't happen. But because there's always a fire to put out, and he's a policy guy, and he'd much rather fight the fight on the policy and advocacy side. But I think I've observed successful shops where, even without development directors, where there's just more of a dedicated, constant
Yeah.
focus
Yeah.
on, it's kind of the goal of creating a culture of fundraising. Some people call it a culture of philanthropy, which is I think what some of the literature says, and I'm going, no. This is a culture of fundraising. When we want our board members to be thinking at all times that this is part of their role, and I don't think we really hit that head on. Someone asked a question about, well, what's the board's role? Well, guess what? Board members need to play a very important role, but.
I think last year when we were doing our campaign, it was 3 days a week that I was doing something related to either individual donors or foundations. But just being intentional, like you can't do it all the time, especially if you're a small shop. Like, I mean, I don't have a development department either. Being intentional about what's the how you prioritize between the staff and make sure that you're doing something at least every week, if not a full day, on looking, checking in, seeking, or prepping, depending on your organization and what your priorities are.
So, some of our students are graduating this semester, others are finishing soon. What is the one advice that you would give them, and to encourage them to find a job in the besides the salary?
I wrote you all a note at the very beginning of the session, which was take accounting. You don't have to take accounting, but I don't think that we talked enough tonight about how important it is to be able to read and understand financial statements and I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with people as a program officer where I'm the person who's delivering the news that they have no money. Because I look at the balance sheet and I'm like, how did you make payroll last? I think that both kind of financial analysis and writing skills are gonna serve you really, really well in the nonprofit sector. Those are hard skill sets to find, and there's not enough of them. So I hope you have them.
Yeah, and there's a real shortage of CFOs, not only in the nonprofit world, but also in the for-profit world, so take accounting.
Well, I'm teaching them budgeting, and they have an assignment due this Sunday.
Yeah.
But it's not financial.
Then we have nonprofit resource development in the spring, which is nonprofit finance, what you need to know from the executive position.
And I guess I would say, I'm sorry, I jumped on you.
please.
No, just, I'm allergic to numbers, but I've had to learn how to find the narrative in a financial report. And so even if you're like I am, are allergic to numbers, maybe you don't take accounting, but you find a way to embrace it and to become financially literate as staff, as board members, as grant maker, as grant seeker, really important.
And I think if you're not volunteering currently, like, and you don't have to direct service volunteer necessarily, and nonprofits, for any of you who might have emailed us asking to volunteer, can be sometimes tricky to get into, because there's generally not someone whose job it necessarily is to directly answer all those emails all the time. But coming to especially small, potentially nonprofits, and saying, hey, here's a project that we want to do, and it requires minimal staff time or attention, and we want to complete this thing that is whichever interest you have, right? Whether it's like working with volunteers or managing an event, or some of the best, staff, like some of the good staff that I have, or staff that I've recommended to other organizations, have been people who came in and like really, really kicked ass on a volunteer project that they self-directed, that didn't take a lot of my time, that showed that they had foresight, that they followed up on. The people who do that and who don't just like send me a list of 20 questions that they need me to answer for their paper, or, like people who follow through and be like, I want to do this for you and it's not going to take a lot of your time because I'm trying to contribute. Those are the kind of people that get remembered and get recommended for jobs.
I think I would say know what your strengths and skills are so that when you come before us, you know how you fit into my vision and mission, and how you contribute to the impact. And that as much as we are needing, so I would just say not sell yourself, but know your value, right? A lot of times in job interviews, we're like, oh my God, I want the job. But I think it's a benefit to say, I'm valuable and you'd be lucky to have me and here's why, right? I think, it's definitely a give and take. So know your strengths and how you can contribute to the overall mission. I think that's impressive to me, so that I don't have to think about how you fit, right? That there's a natural, you've done that work for me, at least in presenting how you could contribute, right? So, yeah.
Don't be afraid of development director jobs.
Yeah.
When I have these conversations, there's a huge need for development directors, and there's a lot of turnover, and hardly anyone that I talk to says that they would like to be a development director.
Okay. I'd like to thank our panelists. Thank you very much.